Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Sunday morning session at the Language Show about translating in the EU. I can see the number of participants going up. I'm going to wait a minute or two so that everybody can come in. In the meantime, why don't you say hello in the chat? Maybe say where you're from, where you're watching from. Say how and why you're interested in this session. I'm going to be answering your questions later on. Hopefully, if we have time, which I'm sure we will. So I can see the number of attendees creeping up. In the meantime, whilst that's going up, let me ask you a couple of questions to get things going in the chat. Hello, Alex. I'm starting to see things come in. By now, you're probably all Zoom aficionados and you know where your raise hands button is. But if you don't, find the raise hands button. And will you raise your hands if you are watching from the UK? So if you're in the UK and watching, I'd like to know where you are. So, okay, I'm seeing that of our attendees so far, 11 out of 28 are in the UK. Good, that's good to know. I'm going to lower your hands, and then I'm going to ask how many of you are watching from a different country in Europe. So if you're watching from a different country in Europe outside the UK, raise your hand now. Okay, a few of those going up. I'm going to note these down actually for interest. Okay. I'm going to lower those hands now. And then last question, is there anybody that is watching from outside of Europe? Anybody that's watching, listening to this from outside Europe, declare yourself now. Oh, one that's then changed their mind and put their hand down again. Okay, maybe there's nobody from outside Europe. That's interesting. Okay, so we've got a European audience. Okay, well, thanks for telling me about yourself. I can see in the chat. Is the UK still in still in Europe? Depends how you define Europe. I always say the European Union is not Europe. So the UK for me certainly is still in Europe. Yeah, thanks for saying hello in the chat. I think now the numbers have stabilized of attendees, so I'm going to go into the session. So this session is all about using your language skills to forge a career as a translator in the European Union. My name's Paul Kay. I work as a translator for the European Union. And what I want to do in this session is to tell you a little bit about the work that we do, what it's like working in the European Union civil service as a translator, and then talk about career opportunities at the end and the different pathways that there are to come in and work as a translator in the European Union. And this should take about half an hour, I would say, and then hopefully we'll have about 15 minutes for questions at the end. I'm not going to be able to track the chat for questions. It's too difficult. So if you've got a question for me, if a question arises whilst I'm talking, can you find the Q&A function in Zoom and put your questions in there? And at the end, when I finish the presentation, that's where I'm going to look for the questions. So that's the only place I'm going to be able to go and look for questions. So put your questions in there. But please feel free to chat among yourselves, obviously, in the chat. So first of all, before I go into the presentation, which will be a PowerPoint, I'm just going to introduce myself and explain very briefly how I got to where I am currently in my career. So I'm British. I grew up monolingually in Northwest England. My first contact with languages was at school, where I did French, the only language we had at my school. But it was my favorite subject and my best subject. I loved it. But because I thought I wanted to be a doctor, I dropped it at A-level at 16 to study sciences. I ended up studying biology at university, but at university I had a great stroke of luck. I managed to wangle my way on to doing an Erasmus study year in France, studying biology, and that really brought up my level of French. After university, I moved to Bratislava in Slovakia, and where I went to teach English. But at the same time, I threw myself into learning the local language, which is Slovak. And after a year of teaching, I moved into journalism. I worked as a radio journalist for a while, and still carrying on improving my knowledge of Slovak. And then eventually, I was able to start taking my first bits of freelance translation and interpreting work once my level of Slovak had got to a good enough level. So translating from Slovak into English. But after a few years in Slovakia, I came back to the UK. I had become very interested in environment issues, very topical at the moment. I worked for a year as a freelance translator interpreter back in England, so as to earn the money to pay for a master's degree in environment policy. And after I did that master's degree in environment policy, that led to me working for 10 years as an environment policy journalist, initially in London, but I was transferred with my news service quite quickly to the Brussels office of my news service, where my job was following the decision-making procedures at EU level, going to the European Parliament, going to the European Commission, and writing about how they were developing EU environment policy. And after a few years of that, I saw that the EU was recruiting translators, staff translators, to work in its civil service. And to do that, you need to have to be able to translate from 2 EU official languages into one other. And I could translate from French and I could translate from Slovak into English, so I was eligible. So I applied, and to my slight surprise, I passed the recruitment tests. And then nearly 13 years ago now, I started working as a translator for the European Commission. So that's how I got to this point in my career, and why I'm sitting in front of your screens telling you about careers in the EU. So after that little pen portrait, I'm now going to go into my presentation. Oh, before I do that, I'll just show you. I'm wearing my EU shirt this morning, especially for the occasion. But let me share my screen. And I hope that you will all be able to see my title slide. So using your language skills to translate for the EU. The EU, the European Union, is that group of 27 now countries that cooperate together for various purposes. It's a multilingual organization. When these countries come together in a decision-making capacity, they make all those decisions in a total of 24 official languages. So they take essentially the official languages of each of the countries, and you bring them all together, and there are 24 covering those 27 countries. Certain languages are shared by more than one country. I mean, of course, in Europe, there are very, very many more languages spoken than 24. But in the context of the European Union, we just use 24 official languages. Now, what are those languages? I know some of you probably know already, but if you don't, here's a little diagram showing what the languages are. 24 languages. They include, these are in the language of the language, not in English. That would be too easy. So we have Français, we have Deutsch somewhere, we have Italiano, we have Espanol, languages which in Anglophone countries at least are very well studied. But there are also languages like Eesti, Estonian, Maltese, Hrvatski, Croatian, which are less well studied, less well known or spoken outside of those countries, but which have got equal status to all the other languages in the European Union. And we need people that can translate into those languages and from those languages and into the others. Those 24 languages are what we call official or working or treaty languages. In practice, what does that mean? That means that Whenever the European Union adopts a new law, it has to publish the text of that law in all 24 of the official languages. When debates happen in the European Parliament, the members of Parliament can address the Parliament in any of those 24 languages, and there is interpretation into and out of those languages. When a citizen wants to address the European institutions, the EU, for instance, if it wants to write to the European Parliament or the European Commission, citizens can write in any of those 24 languages, and they can expect a reply in that language. So that's how the multilingual nature of the European Union works. But of those 24 languages, there are 3 languages that have a sort of slightly different status. And we call those the procedural languages, and they're English, French, and German. These are the languages that the EU civil service, the people who work for the EU, when they're conducting their business internally, having meetings or drafting papers and so on, they work in one of those 3 procedural languages, English, French, or German. In practice, English very heavily predominates as the main internal working language of the European Union institutions, and that will explain a couple of things later in the presentation. But you can imagine that using all these languages creates a lot of work for linguists working for the EU. And we have, if you look at this circle on the left-hand side, we have about 4,000 staff translators working in offices on staff for the European Union institutions, and we have about 1,000 staff interpreters. There are more than that, again, working as freelance translators and freelance interpreters. And these translators are spread across the different institutions of the European Union. Don't need to dwell on this too much, but you will have heard of the European Commission, you will have heard of the European Parliament, maybe the Council of the European Union. The other ones you probably haven't heard of so much, European Central Bank perhaps. These are all the different institutions that go up to make the governing structures of the European Union. And they operate fairly autonomously, and they have their own separate translation services for the most part. The European Committee of the Regions and the European Economic and Social Committee share a translation service. So people who end up working as a staff translator might end up working in any one of these institutions. For certain types of job, there's a single overall recruitment procedure, and I'm going to talk about this. For other types of job, the recruitment is done individually by the institution. But the link that is there at the top in orange is a new page that we've got, which has links to the translation services of all these different institutions. And there's a real wealth of information there. And I'd encourage you to go and check that link out after the talk. I happen to work for the European Commission's translation service, that one at top left, which in terms of staff numbers is the biggest one. So I'm going to describe the work of the European Commission's translation service in the next few slides, only because that's the one I know. The work in the other institutions will be broadly similar. There'll be a lot of common themes, but I'm going to talk about just the European Commission's translation service now. The European Commission, some of you may know, the role of the European Commission is to propose new legislation at EU level. It can't adopt the legislation. It's the governments of the EU and the European Parliament that actually adopt the legislation, but the Commission proposes, drafts new legislation ideas. But it's also in charge of implementing EU policies and supervising compliance with EU law. Once that EU law has been adopted by the member states and the European Parliament, one of the Commission's jobs is to make sure they are complying with that law, which is why you often see in the press disputes between the European Commission and different countries on different parts of EU law. The picture underneath there at the center is Ursula von der Leyen, who you might have heard of. She's the president, so-called president of the European Commission. She's effectively, ultimately my boss. And the people around her are the other 26 European commissioners. So there's one from each member state, and they each have a different policy area. policy that they're responsible for. And underneath them, of course, there's a whole civil service of people that are helping them prepare legislation and help overseeing that compliance with EU law. And among those departments, there's a big translation department, which is where my job comes in. So the European Commission's translation service is known as the Directorate General for Translation, or DG Translation for short. DGT for even shorter, is how we refer to it in-house. We have about 2,000 staff. It's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, translation service in the world. About 70% of those staff are translators. The rest are support staff, so people working in IT, HR, managerial staff, secretarial staff, and so on. Just over 2/3 of our staff are women. And just over half of our staff are based in Luxembourg. You will have heard of Brussels as the capital of Europe, but there's a lot of EU activity and EU employment and offices in Luxembourg, and actually over half of the Commission's translation service are actually based in Luxembourg. I personally am based in the Brussels contingent there. So 2,000 staff in our translation service. How much work do we get through each year? The next slide is going to be the first of several slides where I'm showing you bar charts, but hopefully I'll be able to navigate you through it so it means something to you. But this chart shows how much work we've done over the last 13 years or so. So going from 2007 on the left-hand side to 2020 on the right-hand side. So in 2020, we translated about 2.3 million pages, the whole of the translation service, and that's this column on the right here. The light blue, 31%, corresponds to the amount of pages that were actually translated by our freelance contractors, and I'm going to come to that later on. The dark blue part of the column is the number of pages that were translated by our in-house staff, of which I am one. So you can imagine that column as one gigantic pile of paper, 2.3 million pages high, that we got through in terms of translation last year. But if we take that 2.3 million pages, I said earlier that we translate into and out of all the different languages. Take that 2.3 million pages. The next chart is going to show you the breakdown in terms of the target language. So of those 2.3 million pages, this is the share that was translated into the different EU languages. So if you look at the left-hand side there, and you will perhaps recognize some of the two-letter language codes at the bottom. EN for English, we actually translated more pages into English than any other language, and that's usually the case. And the reason for that is that I talked about the European Commission having a role of overseeing compliance with EU law, and what that means is there's a constant correspondence going on, letter writing between the European Commission and the ministries in the member states, and those ministries are entitled to write to the European Commission in their language. So the Bulgarian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, when it writes to the European Commission on something, writes in Bulgarian. The Hungarian Ministry of Environment writes in Hungarian. When those communications come in, the individuals within the European Commission whose job it is to read and respond to that correspondence, they don't know all the languages. So you'll have an individual who has to look after a particular area of policy and has to read letters from all the 27 countries. They can't do it in all the 24 languages. So of course they get the translation service to translate it, and they can choose for that internal purpose to have the document translated into English or French or German, and usually they choose for it to be translated into English, which is why that pile of English to be translated or translated into English from other languages is so high. But then there's a large amount to be translated into French, into German, into Spanish, and all the other languages into MT, Maltese. That's still a large job. Even the GA there, that's Irish. That's a smaller number, but that figure is growing. But that's the 24 languages. The red column there corresponds to all the translation that we do into languages other than the 24 EU languages, and it's virtually nothing. But the meaning for you of this chart is that if you can translate into, at native speaker level, if you can translate it into any of these languages, detailed at the bottom here, then there's a pile of documents there that you could come and help us to translate into your language from different languages. So I work in the English language department. I can only translate into English. I don't know any other language well enough to translate into anything but English. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about the English language department. And again, only because that's my experience, but the experience of colleagues in all the other language departments, we have 24 language departments, may be similar or different. So the English language department, this is what we look like. Some of us, about two-thirds of us are based in Brussels, including me. A third are based in Luxembourg, and we don't ordinarily get to see each other, but every couple of years we have a sort of an away day team building event where we meet halfway and discuss work, and we get to do group photographs like this one from a few years ago. But there's about, I think something last time we checked, there's about 110 translators at the moment, something like that. We translate from all the EU languages apart from Irish into English, and we cover all the subject areas that the Commission's involved in, and I'll show you a bit about that shortly. But if we go back to that pile of work that needs to be translated into English, what are the languages that we're translating from? So I'm going to show you another bar chart, and it's the penultimate one. And this shows you our source languages. So which languages in the English department do we need to be able to read and to know and to translate from into English? And again, this is a breakdown. We translated in 2020, if you look at the top there, we translated about 140,000 pages last year. And the biggest source language, over 18,000 pages, was in German. So if you're able to translate from German into English, there's a big amount of work there waiting for you to come and apply to do for us. The next biggest pile is Spanish. French is in third, in Italian in fourth. Now that's the top four there are French, German, Italian, Spanish, probably the four most commonly taught and studied languages in Anglophone countries, and we have lots of work in those languages to translate. But then look at the next ones. Romanian, EL is Greek, Polish, Bulgarian, Dutch, Hungarian, large amounts of those that we still need to translate into English, right down to ET, Estonian. I mean, that's still 2,000 pages a year that we need to do. We do a small amount of translation from non-EU languages, a tiny amount of Maltese. We don't do Irish into English. We have an Irish language department who, for fairly obvious reasons, they translate anything both ways, Irish to English and English to Irish. But Romanian, Greek, Polish, Bulgarian, these languages are less commonly studied in Anglophone countries, and it's harder to find native speaker level translators into English that know those languages and that can translate those languages. So we recruit people like that when we can, but it's sometimes difficult. And what that means is if we map this demand, this graph shows the demand for translation from certain languages into English. And if we map that against our internal in-house capacity of those translators that you see on the picture, and then we come up with this. So it's the last bit of graph that I'm going to show you. And this is the difference between in-house translation capacity and demand. And what that means is The languages here on the green side are what we call our surplus languages. We have enough internal capacity to translate those. On the right-hand side, where we have a deficit of capacity. So we're heavily in surplus in French. A lot of our staff are able to translate from French to English, and although we get a lot of work from French to English, we still have more than enough capacity. Now, this doesn't mean, looking at this graph, that doesn't mean that we don't recruit people that can translate from French. Don't worry about that. If you translate from French, we still end up recruiting people that translate from French. But the other language that they can translate is also interesting, or any knowledge of other languages that they have that we can help them develop and use later on is also useful. So languages like these on the red side, what happens in practice is when we can't recruit people with a knowledge of those languages in combination with a native level knowledge of English, is that we provide in-house training for our existing staff so that they can learn these languages in order to start translating them. And that training happens on work time. It's part of the working day. Most of our translators are keen to do it. I mean, I love learning languages, so that's for me is a big part of the perks of the job. And under this scheme, at the moment I'm currently learning Greek, which is very interesting. You can see it's our most deficit language. We get a lot of Greek to translate, and we don't have enough people that can translate it. But I've also learned Hungarian and Polish and Estonian to add to the French and Slovak that I started off with, and I now translate from those languages. Now, Hungarian and Estonian, I translate a lot more slowly. I'm a lot less certain of my ground with them, and I have to be very careful, and I have to make sure that colleagues check my work before the translation is sent out as complete. I mean, we do that with all of our translations. It's always revised by a colleague. But slowly you build up speed, and you build up more expertise and more knowledge of terminology in that language in the different policy areas. So you're sort of on a learning curve, but it's very satisfying if that's the kind of thing you like to do. Okay, so that's the language situation in the department. What about the kind of subject matter that we translate? Well, this graph shows some of the areas that the EU is involved in. The European Union, as you probably know, is involved in lots of different areas of public policy. So these cover things like foreign development aid, monetary policy, energy policy, I think that is chemical regulation, agriculture in the center, environment policy, and many other areas. And so we're dealing with documents and correspondence and laws in all of these different areas. And so you might find yourself translating something on one day. It could be pesticide residues in agricultural crops one day, and the next day it might be something about an inquiry or an investigation into economic competition in the rail sector the next. So you get a wide variety of things that you translate. It's good if you have a knowledge of some of these areas beforehand, before you come to start to work with us, but you don't need it. You develop it on the job, and there's a lot of support and a lot of training available for people to develop expertise in particular areas. So what do we do in terms of day-to-day activities? Well, translation, obviously. I'm not going to go through all of these, but if you look at the left-hand side, we offer full-length translation of documents for our internal clients who are other officials in the European Commission. We offer translation of web pages. The European Commission's, or European Union's web page, europa.eu, is one of the world's biggest. E-translation, we have developed a machine translation service. We're not allowed to use machine translation services like Google Translate or DeepL, but we've developed our own internal one that we use. We recognize the value of machine translation. We sometimes do summaries of documents where a full translation isn't necessary. We will read a document and write a short summary. And other things as well. We have editing services and so on. But this is just to show you that there's a variety of different tasks that go on. It's not all just translation. But beyond that, we also, as a translation service, get involved in other things. And this slide shows some of them. So on the left-hand side here, that's supposed to say Jóvenes Translatores. That's a Young Translator of the Year contest that we organize every year for 17-year-olds throughout the European Union. We organize events celebrating European Day of Languages on the 26th of September every year. We send, under a visiting translator scheme, we send our translators out to do outreach work in government ministries and in universities to give presentations. We organize translation conferences in Brussels and in the member states as a form of outreach, and we do other things as well. And again, that's just showing that when you come to work for us as a translator, there are lots of other things that you can get involved in, and I've been lucky enough to be involved in quite a lot of these schemes that are on that slide. And it makes the job very varied and very satisfying. So that's a little portrait of what it's like to work inside the organization. Now, I'm now going to go through job opportunities. There are 5 basic paths in. There are permanent jobs where you're a so-called EU official. We have temporary staff, which they have the same pay, the same status as our permanent officials, but they're on a fixed-term contract. Then we have contract staff who are in the same way, they're also on staff working in our offices in Brussels or Luxembourg, but also on a fixed-term contract, and but also on a slightly lower salary. I'm going to take those 3 first, and then I'll talk about our external contractors, freelancers, and our trainees. So taking those first 3, the permanent job, the temporary staff, the contract staff, they're all based at our offices in Brussels or Luxembourg, and they work alongside each other. And most of the time, you don't know who is permanent, who is temporary, and who's contract member of staff. But and here are the basic benefits of working on one of those staff roles. There's the starting salary for officials and the temporary agents, and then, as I said, slightly lower for the contract agents. You get very good leave entitlement. The work is, as I've explained, very varied and challenging. Good job security, other than the fact that you might be on a fixed-term contract, but whilst you're on that fixed-term contract, it's good job security. And it's you're working in a multicultural environment with flexible working time arrangements if you have a family, for instance. But that first one, for all 3 of those, you have to be an EU citizen. You have to have a passport of an EU country. So for those that are watching from the UK, if you only have a UK passport, if you don't have a passport of a different EU country through a grandma or granddad or something like that, or through a period of residence in a country, I'm afraid you can't apply for those staff positions, those first 3. And I'm afraid there's no way around that. You have to have a degree in languages or another field. So it doesn't have to be a degree in languages. I don't have a language degree, for instance. You just need to have a degree. You don't need professional experience. Most people in practice do end up having some professional experience by the time they join us, but it's not required. Those are the basic requirements. You need to know 2 other languages in addition to your main language or your mother tongue. So the path for recruiting for the permanent job, first of all, that's done through a body called EPSO, the European Personnel Selection Office. And when it's recruiting, it will publish a notice in the official journal of the European Union and also on its website. That website there, eucareers.eu, is perhaps the most important thing from this talk, is to go to that website. It has a wealth of information about working for the EU, not just as a translator, but all the other job opportunities, including explanations of the process of recruitment, these competitions, this competitive examination procedure for those permanent official jobs. So that's where you go for that. For the temporary staff, the selection of temporary staff, it's run by the individual institutions that you saw on that earlier slide. Sometimes it's supported by EPSO. And for information on those vacancies, you should check that link regularly, or the link that was on the earlier slide and that I'll put on the final slide as well for the different institutions. And the recruitment process does involve tests in the same way. It's not quite as long a procedure as for the permanent posts. As for recruitment, well, we're able to say that next year, DG Translation, so the Commission's translation service, is going to be looking to recruit translators that work into the following languages: English, which is great, but also if you can translate into Hungarian or into Croatian or into Dutch or Portuguese from 2 other EU languages into those languages, then we think at some point next year there's going to be a recruitment exercise. We don't know yet whether it will be for permanent staff or for temporary staff. You're going to have to keep checking those links. Then the third of those staff positions is contract staff. They are recruited through something called CAST, that's Contract Agent Selection Tool. That's a website which is open at all times. At any time, you can fill in your details at the website that you see there. And when the institutions need to recruit people on contracts, they can go to that list and pick people out and give them some tests and recruitment. So that's another place that you can go to enter your details as another route in. The external contractors, you saw that 30%, 31% of our translation work last year was done by freelance translators. Now, our freelance translators, they can be based anywhere. If you are a UK passport holder, you'll be pleased to know that you can still work as a freelance translator for us, as long as it's through an agency that is based in the European Union. You only need 1 language combination for that. You don't have to offer more than 1. And the way we recruit our freelance translators is through periodic calls for tender to bid your translation services to us, or bid for our translation contracts, usually through an agency. And there's more information there about how to do that. We had a call that ended last year in a current list of contractors, which means that when we, the European Commission, are not looking anytime soon, it will be 2, 3 or 4 years before we do another call for tenders. The other institutions, I don't know, they may be doing calls for tenders, and you can check their calls for tender at the links that I've been showing you and that are going to be coming up again. And that final link there is where you can see a list of our current contractors for the different language combinations. And there's also information there about what we pay for those contracts per page, which you might find useful and interesting. And the final one, trainees, which is what we call interns. And we also call them stagiaires. These are usually they last 5 months. There are 2 intakes a year in March and October, and you have to apply several months before for those. They're for university graduates only. They're for EU citizens, but there are a limited number of places for non-EU nationals. You have to translate from at least 2 EU languages into one other, so like our regular staff translators. And you work in our offices alongside our staff translators. It's a real good insight into what the work is like. There's a monthly grant, as they call it, of 1,200 euros. And there's more information there where you can look into applying for those. So they're the different paths in. Here are some web and social media links. That first one is a repeat of the link that was up earlier in the presentation. It's really got an awful lot of information there about translation in all the different institutions, not just the European Commission, which is the one I've mainly talked about here, but then we have Facebook and Twitter and so on. So that's it. I'm going to say thank you in the 24 official languages of the EU. I'm on Twitter there if you're on that and want to interact. If you want to email me, if I don't manage to get through all your questions in the last bit of time that we have available, then email me there and I'll try to answer them. But that's it. So thank you very much. I'm now going to stop sharing my screen and go back so I can see the questions and so on. And we'll go through some questions in the last bit of time we have available. So now, right, I've gone 10 minutes over the time that it took me when I rehearsed this. So we've only got a few minutes left, but I'll see how many I can get through in this time. And as I say, you can contact me by email afterwards if you want to know more. So I'm just going to go from top to bottom in the Q&A section. Alex Vogel, is it realistic to switch to translation or interpretation at the age of 40 plus? Alex, I turned 40 a couple of months after I started, and there have been people that have joined us older than me. So absolutely, certainly in terms of the EU institutions, any experience you have in other areas would be very valuable. So really don't let that put you off. The upper age limit for applying for us is retirement age, and you're probably well off that. Easy Vivian, is it easier to get a job within the EU if you know a richer language such as Maltese, which isn't as widely spoken? Yes, Izzy, if you might have seen from the slide there, certainly in the English language departments, translating into English, if you know a language like Greek or Hungarian or Romanian, you saw our deficit languages, if you're able to translate from one of those, you would be objectively, all of the things being equal, probably more valuable to our recruitment managers than somebody that translated from French and German. But I repeat, that doesn't mean we don't recruit people with French and German. We do all the time. Do you have to have two languages to qualify? Yes, and this is from Marendrala. For our staff translators, you have to be able to translate from two languages into one other. If you only have one combination, you can apply for that freelance work, but that would be indirectly through translation agencies. Izzy, I see you've put a few questions in. If it's all right, Izzy, I'll go to other people's questions so that everybody gets at least a bite. And if we've got time, I'll come back to yours. So Lucy, since there's a surplus of certain languages and as British citizens, we can no longer work in-house, does this mean British people with fairly common language combinations, French and Spanish, would not get as much freelance work? Difficult for me to tell. I mean, that we probably contract out less French and Spanish than we do Polish, Czech, Slovak, for instance. But we still, if you look at the link that I put in the slide there, to the list of contractors, you will see a list of several contractors from French and Spanish into excuse me, French and Spanish into English. And so there is work being sent to those contractors. Alex, again, same thing. I'll just skip over people who've already had one question answered and hopefully come back to them. Is it possible to just translate into your mother tongue? Irene Lana says that, or Irene Lana. Well, not just possible, but preferable. That's our standard. That's the usual state of affairs. I know for many people who are working with languages which are less commonly studied in the Anglosphere, they find that they have to translate both ways. For instance, Hungarian, Polish, languages like that. And so they will often find themselves routinely translating into English from those languages. But in our system, the default is that you translate into your mother tongue. But there are people that have passed our recruitment tests to be able to translate at mother tongue level into, say, English, and who aren't mother tongue speakers per se. Nicole Derisson, is it a plus to have an active language that you can translate into other than your passive languages? Is German still a competitive language to apply with? I'm not sure what you mean by that, Nicole. We only ever translate into one language. So you end up working in a translation department, language department, and you only ever translate into that language for the most part. So if you can translate into another language, it wouldn't be seen as much of a benefit. But if you can translate from an additional language to the two that you came in with, that's certainly a benefit. Patricia says, I'm a conference interpreter, be interested in working freelance for the EU. Patricia, this session is about translating. There have been sessions in the language show, several sessions about interpreting, where my interpreter colleagues have been talking about that. So I would recommend that you look into those where you'll have a lot more information. Yeah, we don't do both, by the way. You either end up as a translator or an interpreter if you're working as a staff member for the EU. Olga Barlow, is there any demand from Russian translators contractor? Very little. Our volumes are very small in the other languages. So unfortunately, Olga, there's very little demand for translation from Russian into other languages. Can the traineeship be done remotely? No, it is based at our offices. I'm not sure how it's worked with people during the pandemic, but I'm pretty sure people have had to come to Brussels or to Luxembourg. And if they've had to work from home, they've had to work from a home there. And Robert is the final one I see at the bottom. I recently acquired German citizenship. Would you say I have an advantage now and should apply to be a translator? Where should I look first? Well, if you are British and you have native level English, because large swathes of our potential pool of recruits, i.e. British people that no longer have a passport of an EU country because the UK has left, there is going to be a smaller number of native English speakers that we can recruit from for our translation into English. So in that sense, Robert, yes, I think Brexit has proved a positive for you. I don't know whether in other senses it has. I have an advantage, and should I apply to be a translator? Yes, I think you should. Where should you look first? I think we'd go through some of the links that I've been showing you in the talk. Okay, we're a couple of minutes over. I'm going to carry on answering the questions until Jonathan, the organizer, tells me that we really have to wrap up. So I'm going to go back to the ones that I haven't done. So, Izzy, would I be able to speak about the traineeships a little? Well, I've given a little bit of information about that. I don't know if you put that in before I'd actually spoken about them. Is it possible to become a staff translator and then become a staff interpreter? It is. We do have people that join as a translator and then they switch to interpreting. They still have to qualify and do the same tests that the interpreters have to do if they were being recruited to be an interpreter. But yes, we do have people who go in the different directions occasionally, not as often as you'd think, actually. Is there a possibility to learn languages alongside working as a translator? Absolutely. As I mentioned, certainly in the department I'm in, the English language department, we're encouraged to learn new languages. I'm currently learning Greek. At 8:30 tomorrow morning, I'll be tuning in on Zoom for my 2-hour Greek language class. It's 4 hours a week. Sometimes in the translation service, when we've got a particular demand for a language, we will organize a special intensive language course. So that's how I did Hungarian and Estonian. And they're all on working time. People tend to invest a bit of their own time as well, doing more homework at home and so on. We get to do immersion stays in the relevant country where the time that we spend in the country is considered working time, but we have to pay our own expenses. In the past, it used to be the case that we got all the expenses paid. Now we have to invest our own money in expenses, but many people, including me, still find that a good deal. I'm being asked to wrap up by the organizer, so I'll just see if I can go through one more. Let me see. I think I've gone through all of them, actually. Zofia says, how did COVID influence your work day-to-day basis? Working from home. Yeah, working from an office from home. And then Sophie says, are practice tests available? Yes, go to the EPSO website, the EU Careers website, and you'll find some practice examples there, but there are also lots of others available online commercially and so on. Right, I hope we've got through all of them. If there's anything that comes to you when you watch this back, or if you think about afterwards that you want to ask, then please drop me a line by email, and I'll try to answer it. But in the meantime, thanks very much for listening. I hope you found it useful. I hope you've enjoyed the language show, which is now coming to an end. And good luck in your language endeavors, and perhaps we'll see each other in real life in the future at some point. Thanks a lot. Bye.